Our Episode 2, Segment 1, Education, Literacy, and the Quiet Preservation of Knowledge. Good evening. There is nothing you need to follow closely tonight. Nothing you need to memorize, nothing you need to keep hold of. This is a slow story, a gentle one. If your attention drifts, that is a sign that rest is beginning. Tonight, we move into a different kind of care. Not care for the body, but care for memory, for words, for learning, for the fragile thread of knowledge that can easily be lost when the world becomes unstable. For much of human history, literacy was rare. Reading and writing were not assumed skills, they were privileges. In ancient societies, knowledge often belonged to elites, to scribes, to officials, to courts and temples. When those structures collapsed, knowledge often vanished with them. Scrolls burned, libraries emptied, languages faded. This happened many times. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, much of Europe experienced profound disruption. Cities shrank, trade declined. Formal schooling nearly disappeared. For long stretches of time, there were no state institutions capable of maintaining education, and yet learning did not vanish. It retreated, quietly, into small, stable communities that valued continuity over speed. Many of those communities were religious. Monasteries became places where reading and writing continued even when they were no longer economically useful. This is important to understand, because education requires patience. And patience is often scarce during times of crisis. Monks copied texts by hand, slowly, carefully. A single manuscript could take months, sometimes years, to complete. There was no immediate reward, no mass distribution, just preservation. In monasteries across Europe, texts from ancient Greece and Rome were copied and recopied. Works by Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Virgil, not because they were fashionable, but because they were considered worth keeping. Alongside these were texts on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and agriculture, knowledge about crops, about seasons, about healing herbs. This knowledge mattered for everyday survival, but it also mattered for something deeper, continuity. When knowledge survives, a society can rebuild. When it does not, each generation must start again. One of the most influential developments in this quiet preservation was the rise of the scriptoria. Scriptoria were rooms within monasteries dedicated to copying texts. They were simple spaces, wooden desks, natural light when possible, silence. In these rooms, learning was treated as stewardship, something held in trust. The goal was not innovation, it was survival. By the 7th and 8th centuries, monastic centres in places like Ireland played a crucial role. Ireland had not been part of the Roman Empire, and yet it became a refuge for learning. Irish monks travelled across Europe, bringing books, establishing schools, and reintroducing literacy to regions where it had declined. Figures such as Columbanus founded monasteries in Gaul and Italy that became centres of education. These institutions taught reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. They trained not only monks, but future administrators, advisors, and teachers. Education was not widespread, but it was continuous, and continuity matters more than scale when survival is at stake. Over time, these small centres formed networks. Manuscripts moved between monasteries. Knowledge spread slowly, but steadily. This movement laid the groundwork for later educational revival. By the 9th century, under Charlemagne, there was a renewed emphasis on learning. Charlemagne issued decrees encouraging schools to be established at monasteries and cathedrals. His goal was practical. Better education meant better governance, better record-keeping, better communication. But the infrastructure already existed. It had been quietly maintained for centuries. Schools attached to churches became common. These schools taught basic literacy, Latin, music. Music mattered because it required memory, pattern recognition, and discipline. These skills translated into broader learning. As towns grew in the High Middle Ages, education expanded beyond monastic walls. Cathedral schools emerged in cities such as Paris, Chartres, and Bologna. These schools attracted students from across Europe. They taught theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. Eventually, these schools evolved into universities. The University of Bologna, often dated to 1088, focused on law. The University of Paris, emerging in the 12th century, became a centre of theology and philosophy. Oxford followed soon after. These institutions were not created by states. They grew out of church-run schools. They inherited their methods, their language, their respect for texts. Importantly, they preserved the idea that learning was worth pursuing for its own sake. This idea is easy to take for granted now, but it is fragile. When societies are under pressure, education is often the first thing cut. And yet, for centuries, these institutions protected it, not loudly, not perfectly, but persistently. As you rest now, there is no need to track the timeline. Just notice the pattern. Learning continuing when it was no longer convenient. Words copied when there was no immediate benefit. Knowledge preserved so that future generations would not have to begin again from nothing. Take a slow breath in and let it go. We will continue shortly. Episode 2, Segment 2. Education, Literacy, and the Quiet Preservation of Knowledge continued. As learning continued within monasteries and cathedral schools, another quiet shift was taking place. Literacy, once tightly bound to elites, began to move slowly outward. Not quickly, not universally, but steadily. In the early medieval world, to read and write was to hold power. It meant access to law, to contracts, to records, to memory itself. Those who could read could shape how events were remembered. Because of this, education was carefully guarded. And yet, within church-run schools, a subtle broadening occurred. Clergy needed to read scripture, they needed to copy texts, they needed to teach others. This created a practical incentive to expand literacy beyond a narrow circle. Choir schools trained boys to read music and text. Cathedral schools educated not only future priests, but also scribes, administrators, and advisors. These students often came from modest backgrounds. Education became a path not to wealth, but to stability. And stability mattered. In a world where inheritance was uncertain and land ownership limited, learning offered a different form of security. A learned person could serve, they could advise, they could teach. They were useful across borders and rulers. This quietly increased social mobility, not dramatically, but meaningfully. Libraries formed alongside schools. At first, these libraries were small, a handful of manuscripts carefully stored. Books were precious. A single volume could represent months of labor, expensive materials, and years of accumulated knowledge. Libraries were not decorative, they were functional. They existed to preserve continuity. Rules governed their use. Books were chained to desks, not to restrict learning, but to protect it. Loss was irreversible. As universities emerged, book culture expanded further. By the 13th century, a book trade began to form. Manuscript production increased. Textbooks were copied in sections, allowing students to share access. This system, known as the Patia system, was used at universities such as Paris and Bologna. Knowledge became more accessible even before printing. Importantly, this expansion did not erase reverence for learning. Texts were still treated with care. Reading was still slow. This slowness shaped thinking. Ideas were considered deeply, not skimmed. This encouraged reflection, debate, and synthesis. Even disagreement was structured. Scholasticism, a method of learning developed in medieval universities, emphasized careful reasoning. Questions were posed gently, arguments were examined patiently. This method trained minds to tolerate complexity, to sit with uncertainty. These habits matter far beyond education. They influence how societies reason, how they disagree, how they govern. And they emerged in classrooms built on quiet preservation. As you rest now, there is no need to hold these details. Just notice the rhythm. Learning widening, books multiplying slowly, care for knowledge becoming shared. Take another breath. We continue. Episode 2, Segment 3, Education and Stability Through Change. As Europe moved into the later medieval period, the pace of change increased. Cities grew, trade expanded, ideas travelled faster. With growth came tension. Old systems were challenged, new questions emerged. Education became more important, not less. People needed to navigate contracts, laws, and institutions. Literacy was no longer optional for those involved in civic life. Church-run schools responded by adapting. Curricula expanded. Arithmetic was taught for commerce. Law was studied for governance. Medicine was formalized for public health. Education became practical while remaining grounded in older traditions. This balance helped societies absorb change without losing continuity. During times of conflict, schools often persisted even when politics shifted. A ruler might change, borders might move, but a school remained. This continuity mattered deeply. It meant that knowledge did not reset with every upheaval. Even during wars, teachers taught, students studied. Learning continued, sometimes quietly, sometimes under strain, but rarely abandoned altogether. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century dramatically changed access to books. Johannes Gutenberg's press, developed around 1440, allowed texts to be reproduced quickly and cheaply. This was revolutionary. But it did not create a love of learning from nothing. It amplified what already existed. Centuries of manuscript culture had prepared society to value books, to trust written words. Without that foundation, printing would have been meaningless. Church institutions played a role in early printing as well. Many of the first printed books were religious texts, educational materials, and classical works preserved earlier. Again, continuity mattered. The old and the new met gently. As literacy expanded further, education increasingly moved into the public sphere. States began to assume responsibility for schooling, but they inherited models already tested. Curricula, methods, structures, even secular education was shaped by habits formed earlier. As you lie here now, you may feel your thoughts slow. That is appropriate. Education at its best was never rushed. It unfolded over lifetimes, and the preservation of knowledge required patience above all else. We move toward the close. Episode 2, Segment 4, The Legacy of Quiet Learning. By the time the modern world emerged, education was widely accepted as essential. This acceptance was not sudden, it was learned. Through centuries of continuity, through classrooms that persisted when everything else seemed uncertain, through teachers who taught even when rewards were modest, the idea that learning should be protected became embedded in culture. Even today, universities trace their origins to medieval church schools. Libraries still echo monastic practices, silence, order, care for books. Even the academic calendar reflects older rhythms, terms, seasons, rest periods. These patterns remain because they work. As societies secularized, education did not lose its moral dimension. The belief that knowledge should serve humanity endured. That learning should elevate, not merely profit. This belief was inherited, not imposed. It grew quietly, alongside care for the sick, the poor, and the vulnerable. Education was another form of care for the future. As you rest now, there is no need to remember names or dates, just the feeling of continuity, the sense that learning was guarded even when fragile. That someone somewhere kept copying words so that others could read them later. This quiet persistence made the modern world possible, and tonight you rest within that inheritance. There is nothing more to do. Sleep can come naturally now. The story will be here whenever you return.